I know you used to be a big power user of Huawei devices, and thanks for lending all of your personal information to China. Appreciate that. But kidding, maybe I don't know, whatever. But the uh, big news: Huawei's back in the phone business. They'd kind of disappeared, or at least they disappeared outside of China for a while.
Yeah, this is a great intersection between a lot of conversations that we've had on the 6.5. And one of them is the ongoing saga of China versus US regarding cutoffs in the technology, right? And I always like to tell the big picture of this. This goes back decades to when China was blocking, companies like IBM and Cisco, and then the thing that's true today, which is most online services are blocked. U.S. online services are blocked in China, and China essentially copies, the Facebooks, the Twitters, Google search, and things like that. So here we are today, where the U.S. thought it had cut off Huawei from advanced semiconductor tech, but also you have to get a waiver if and when from the US federal government if you're going to provide anything to Huawei. But here, this mystery, I'll call it the mystery phone, right? The P60 and the P60 Pro come out. On day of launch, the company didn't even talk about what processor was inside, didn't talk about whether it supported 5G or 4G, which, quite frankly, was bizarre. And then you saw phones that were provided to reviewers. Now, remember, this is a China-only phone. Huawei sampled this well beyond Chinese phones, and so even the people who were writing about the phone didn't even know what it supported. And oh, by the way, the timing just happened to coincide where the highest level U.S. diplomat on trade, Raimondo, came over and was visiting, right? And then the entire Chinese press got around that. It was a feeding frenzy. A lot of questions about this phone, and then what popped up was Hynix memory, right? Hynix is not allowed to sell flash memory to Huawei without a waiver, right? And even Hynix is trying to figure out where this came from, right? Was it black market? Was it left over from 18 months ago when the initial sanctions were put in? Nobody quite knows. And by the way, why didn't Huawei use indigenous flash? Why didn't they use indigenous memory from China? That's a weird one, right? You and I have talked about how Micron has been cut off or greatly reduced from certain types of applications here. There was some dialogue about Qualcomm and what this meant. And here's the bizarre part. Qualcomm zeroed out Huawei a long, long time ago, right? So no revenue. But for some reason, again, I question the intelligence of the stock market on this one. SMIC, which, by the way, is the foundry that supposedly created this 7 nanometer N+2 chip, which, by the way, is close in characteristics to TSMC 6 nanometer, right? It's not leading edge, not even close. People are wondering how they could possibly provide the volumes to Huawei. And the final bizarre thing about this is, I think 10 days after launch or something like that, the company did say, no, this supports 5G, but there's not a single video in any of the reviewers that shows it connecting to a 5G network.
Yeah.
So again, this is why I wanted to call this Huawei's mystery phone. And apparently one of our state senators who leads a committee on commerce has opened up an investigation on this. Because if you think, how could SMIC do this without U.S. technology? Hey, did they use the software, right? Any of the software tools from, companies that we cover, did they use any of the core IP building blocks that have restrictions in China from the US? Anyways, it's the mystery phone. We might be talking about this a little bit more in the future, Dan. I don't know.
Well, we all know for sure that they don't pay for a lot of software. That's kind of a well-known thing in China, right? That goes back to that joke I made about VMware. How many VMware licenses does China own? Anyways, but there's so many weird implications here, Pat, and this kind of all does tie together a little bit. I've talked a lot about China and microaggressions for a while. And then, there's so much kind of conflict between, are we doing this well or are we not, in terms of how we're managing this? I shared an article, Pat, a week ago that talked about how the US is using all these kind of sensors, these cheap IoT sensors in military grade devices from China, rather than using, it's just slightly more expensive US based technology. I know it's not related to a phone, but I'm saying it's weird that we pick something and then we get really focused on it and then we don't pick other things. And then are they really a threat or are they not a threat? I was listening to one expert online this morning, a policy expert, talking about how, China's aggressive consideration of going back for Taiwan, and it could happen in the next 7 years. And it's funny how we just kind of shrug that off. That's a freaking huge deal. It's a huge, huge deal, but it's well, it's not a problem yet. But that, there's certainly consideration that China's ramping up to take military action with the US. I mean, look, us cutting them at the knees on AI is not a small, inconsequential thing. And we've also known for a long time that China is a massive market for so many of these technology companies. So many of them are dependent on being able to sell stuff in China. And when you take away the ability for them to sell stuff to China, it does actually cause an impact to growth for US-based companies. So there is that kind of push and pull effect going on of, can we sell and what should we sell? What's a military grade risk, and is it just about military and defense, or is it really just about technology leadership as a whole? The war is a race right now. The war for AI is a race, and the race is won by slowing them down. I think what we're seeing with the SMIC and the 7 nanometer thing is they're going to find a way, with or without EUV, with or without, to be able to get access. And the way they'll get access, we don't actually know for sure, Pat, but I think you said something to me about gray market. You and I are talking about there's always a way this stuff ends up where it's not supposed to end up. And so, what you brought up about SK, what you brought up about these different parts, but then of course, if China wants to put off this perception that they're this powerhouse national capable of building their own stuff, but then they're still having to get all the capabilities, the intellectual property, the building blocks, the memory from outside of China, how capable are they? And how much of this can they actually build? How fast can they build? And then at the same time, Pat, didn't they just ban the use of iPhones from a whole bunch of their citizens, mostly the government ones? But, that was a pretty big step. And by the way, Apple got pounded this week based on the proclamations of potential lower sales in China.
Yeah.
I already know Apple was making some strategic moves to go to, India, building more in India, at least from a manufacturing standpoint. But the Chinese market is incredibly nuanced and complex right now. And, them wanting to build their own phone, Pat, I mean, the Qualcomm thing, I think you nailed it. It's a total nothing burger. Qualcomm,
yeah.
It's as bad as the Apple and Qualcomm relation conversations. Look, Qualcomm's already for over a year or 2 years now in their investor decks communicated what's happening with Apple. It's no surprise and no secret there. Same thing with Huawei. So that's a weird one to me. But the real question is, can China build at scale competitive devices without using intellectual property that's part of this ban or part of these chip controls? And Pat, unless I'm mistaken, to build a super phone that's going to compete with a Snapdragon or to compete with an iPhone, they need leading edge technology that's probably going to be processed below 7 nanometer. So unless I'm mistaken, I don't understand entirely how they're going to do it at scale when there's no technology to manufacture those chipsets, at least that I'm aware of, that they have the access to get their hands on. So, and by the way, I'm not saying I have all the information here, but if I'm mistaken, I don't understand how this is going to get done at scale. And by the way, China has a few billion people. So if this thing started to sell at scale in China, are they going to be able to? So how much capacity could they make of these devices?
Not a lot. Not a lot.
And that seems to be a problem for me to try to kind of math this thing. Is so how big of an opportunity does it really become for Huawei And by the way, does Huawei have any chance outside of maybe selling their phones in the U.S. and Russia, or sorry, the U.S., China and Russia? Are there any other markets that are going to really adopt these? So I'm going to leave that there. Very interesting though, Pat. And there's a confluence of things coming together that are just making this China thing more and more interesting to kind of keep tabs on.
I call this the hallmark topic. It's the gift that's going to keep on giving.